The next presenter is coming from a little bit of a different angle. For once, it's not a supplier telling you what you should do. We haven't forgotten that we've got a stake in what we have to do ourselves. But the next speaker, Curtis Alcock, actually comes from a background as a colleague to yours. He's a partner in a family practice with a prototypical English name of Broom, Reed and Harris. Sounds a little bit like a store. I hope I'm not insulting Curtis Alcock out there. But he has been very active in taking these ideas to his heart and see how it could impact his own practice. He's also the founder of an online hearing think tank called audira.org. But with those words, I will please have you help me welcome Curtis Alcock on the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we don't have to be involved in hearing care for very long before we realize just how negative people's attitudes towards hearing aids can be. It's as if we have to peel away the layers of resistance that people bring with them into our consulting rooms before we even get the opportunity to work with them to improve their hearing. And those are just the people who have made it through our doors. Because according to the latest studies, for every one person that we fit with hearing aids, we leave another 3 people behind. 3 people who may benefit from hearing aids, but who are currently doing nothing about it. So it's not even as if we've lost those 3 people to one of our competitors, because they too are having exactly the same problem that we are. That for every one person that they fit with hearing aids, they too are leaving another 3 people behind. Which means that between us and our nearest competitors, there are now 6 people out there who may benefit from hearing aids, but no one has been able to reach. And when we multiply this up across all the hearing aid providers in our local areas, and across our cities, and across our states, and across our nations, we get some idea of just how vast this untapped market potential really is. In fact, it's a number so vast that if we were to focus on it, then we would very well come away believing that there's no way that we could ever change anything, that the task would seem just too huge. But if instead we focus on the 3 people that we currently leave behind, then suddenly that task becomes doable, it becomes manageable, and it becomes achievable. Because if we could just reach one of those 3 people, then we would be doubling the sizes of our practices. And if we could find a way to reach 2 of those people, then we'd be tripling the sizes of our practice. And all without having to try to fight with one another, to try and compete to get the guy up the street customers, or to find a way to poach from our neighbors. And so the question we're constantly asking ourselves in this profession and in this industry is, how do we increase the number of people wearing hearing aids? How do we go about reaching those 3 people? Now, when we discuss this amongst ourselves, sooner or later, someone will say to us, well, you know what the problem is? People just don't like hearing aids. So we're trying to give them something they just don't want. And then other times, someone will say to us, well, you know, we'll never be able to increase the number of people wearing hearing aids until attitudes change. It's as if there's this magical day in the future that we all believe in, that these 3 people will suddenly wake up and say to themselves, you know what? I was wrong about hearing aids. I should get me some. But when we look at the research on how attitudes work, we see a different story altogether. And we discover that we've been approaching this all wrong. Because it turns out that if you and I are serious about reaching the 3 people we currently leave behind, we have to understand 2 things. Firstly, that attitudes in society can and do change, even to things which in the past society's had a negative attitude towards. And they can even change real quick once the conditions are right. But those conditions never come by themselves. Attitudes in society do not change by themselves. There are always, always, always instruments of change. Men and women like you and I who work together to systematically create the right conditions for attitudes to change. So we need to learn how to become instruments of change. The second thing is this, that people are not born with a negative attitude towards hearing aids. They're learning them along the way by the things that they see, the things that they hear. Oh yeah, it's in the picture now. The things that they see, the things that they hear, the things that they do, and the things that they feel. And so if we could understand how and when those attitudes are getting formed, then we'll be able to focus in the right places to be able to have the greatest effect. And what we'll discover is that just like this rail track switch here, it often takes just a few small changes, but focused in the right place, to have a huge effect further down the line. And so that's what this session is about. What do you and I need to do in order to shape people's attitudes, in order to change the response towards hearing aids? So let's get started by looking at how attitudes work. Now, finally, right. Now, the world is an incredibly complex place. There are so many things competing for our attention and demanding things from us that somehow we need to make sense of it all, to work out what's good for us and what's bad, to work out what to avoid and what to approach. And attitudes are like having a guidebook that tell us what we should be avoiding and what we should approach. And we have attitudes for everything we encounter in life. Attitudes tell us what to pay attention to. They tell us where to spend our resources, whether those resources are financial, whether they're emotional, whether they're time, whether they're effort, whatever. Attitudes also tell us how to behave in particular circumstances and what's expected of us. Now, underlying attitudes are these two drivers, avoid and approach. Now, if we look at that dog there, we all recognize the signals it's giving out. It says avoid. Whereas that same dog, as a puppy, will send out a different set of signals. So even the youngest child will want to reach out to that puppy. So there are things that are built into us that we recognize signals that tell us whether we should avoid or approach something. Happens with us as well. So we instinctively are attuned to one another, particularly facial expressions. So we'll often find ourselves mirroring each other's facial expressions. And by doing so, this actually changes the way that we ourselves feel. And then we take that emotion that we now feel and we apply it to whatever's most obvious in the environment. Some of our attitudes are imposed on us from wider society. For example, we're expected to avoid waste. But in the UK particularly, we're expected to recycle. Other attitudes, we deliberately choose ourselves to say something about us, either to ourselves or to the rest of the world. And this is something that advertisers are particularly good at tapping into, because they understand that attitudes basically people learn attitudes as they go along. And so they can be shaped by the things that they see, the things that they hear, the things that they do, and the things that they feel. But they always follow those same underlying principles of avoid the things that are bad for you, approach the things that are good for you. So we'll instinctively avoid loss or the sense of loss, but we'll instinctively approach things that bring us benefit, that bring us gain, or give us a sense of winning. We'll avoid being cut off from our social groups, but we'll approach things that strengthen our belonging to the group, which is why so many people want to try and fit in with their group, or do things to make other people like them, or do things to make the group need them in some way. And if they can't find that, they'll find another group. We also instinctively avoid threats to ourselves. And that's not just physical threats, like the man here, but it's also threats to how we want people to see us. We approach things that are consistent with how we see ourselves. We do things that we want to attain to or aspire to. Now, attitudes vary in strength. So at one extreme, we've got very strong positive attitudes where someone will like something and want to approach it. But at the other end, we've got strongly negative where someone will dislike something and want to avoid it. And there in the middle, we've got a neutral attitude. Now, a neutral attitude is where somebody really hasn't made up their minds, or they don't know, or they haven't yet encountered it. Now, when an attitude is neutral, it's more like a wet lump of clay that can be shaped. But once an attitude becomes stronger, either more positive or more negative, it becomes more fixed, a bit like a fired lump of clay. And so now the interesting thing for us to ask ourselves is, where do we perceive society's attitudes towards hearing aids? So let's have a show of hands. Who thinks it's mainly positive around here? Oh, come on. No. Okay. Who thinks it's mainly neutral around here? Oh, dear. Okay, right. Who thinks it's mainly negative around here? Oh, good. People's arms are working. Fine. All right. Okay, well, it turns out that the majority of people have a fairly neutral attitude towards most things unless that thing has become either important to them or relevant to them. And so since the majority of society do not consider hearing aids to be relevant to them, they will actually have a fairly neutral attitude towards hearing aids until it is somehow made relevant to them or important to them. Now, we can make it relevant to them by asking them in a survey, what do you think of hearing aids? That makes it relevant to them. So then they've got to try and cobble together an attitude on the spot. But if they've never been asked about it, then it's likely that they have a fairly neutral attitude. So let's see how this applies. Oh, sorry, I was going to say that by contrast, as you've just demonstrated, by the time they come in and see us, they've got a fairly negative attitude. So somewhere between them having this fairly neutral attitude that can be shaped and coming in and seeing us, something's gone wrong. And so if we could understand how that attitude is getting formed and when, we'd know where to focus our efforts in order to create a change in attitudes before they come through our doors. And so to understand how attitudes work, there are basically two different ways that somebody will form an attitude. On the one side, we have what I would call a ready-made attitude. Now, a ready-made attitude is one where we don't have to make it up ourselves. We basically look around us to see what everyone else is doing, or we rely on things like, what do the experts say? Or is the person telling me about this attractive? Or how am I feeling? Is the sun shining? Do I feel happy? And we apply that to whatever's most obvious at the time. And so because this takes less effort, basically people will use a ready-made attitude the less relevant something is to somebody or the less important it is to somebody. By contrast, once it becomes more relevant, people will spend more effort in making that attitude, in formulating it themselves. And they'll be using the raw ingredients, just like this Thanksgiving dinner here, of their thoughts, their feelings, and their emotions.